American pressure, more guts and swagger that we're talking about in other areas of the world, that we should be focusing in the same areas with some of our African nations and brothers and sisters in humanity. And it does, to me, send out a stunning reflection of our values. As you know, budgets reflect values. When we are announcing rescission packages that do things that just don't seem to make economic sense as well as moral sense. And I know you operate with a strong moral core and also an understanding of fiscal conservatism about making investments that can save our country money. And the rescission of the $232 million for Ebola funding just struck me as staggering when we know from past experience with outbreaks, a small amount invested could save us a tremendous amount on the back end on a fiscal manner, but just the human suffering alone that the United States has something to do. And I just appeal to you, not just as a fellow American, but a fellow humanitarian, to give some focus to the DRC, give some focus to what's going on with American posture and resources in dealing with the Ebola virus. We have so much power in this country, and this is a place where if we make the investment, if we apply the focus, we can make a tremendous impact on human suffering. And it's not going to be on the front page of the New York Times. It won't be talked about on CNN when they want to talk about what they seem to be distracted by these days. But when you and I are towards the end of our lives, you're in a position right now where you can make a difference on these issues in such a substantive way.
Thank you, Senator Booker.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Senator Paul.
I think many people would admit that the Iran agreement had some deficiencies. One of the largest deficiencies might have been that the $100 billion was released all at once instead of maybe gradually to help modulate behavior over a longer period of time. That being said, the $100 billion that was released was a great inducement to get Iran to sign the agreement. That was a carrot. And that carrot's gone. They've gotten the good thing, and now we want compliance, and now we're pulling out. And so the question is, what are the next inducements to get them to sign things, or will there not be? I think there's a question with, there are two possibilities basically of what will happen. So you reintroduce the strongest sanctions ever. They either don't work, that's one possibility because they're unilateral, and some say unilateral sanctions won't work. Let's say they don't work. That means Europe, China, and Russia continue to trade with them, and Iran says, well, they're going to continue to trade with us. We'll just keep abiding by the agreement. They don't develop any more nuclear weapons or technology towards that, but they don't do anything else that you would like, ballistic missiles, less terrorism. So really, basically, we don't get what we want if the sanctions don't work. Second possibility, let's say the sanctions do work. We have enough manipulation of money that flows through us from Europe. Europe does a lot of trade with us. Europe buckles. I think Russia and China still will trade with them, but let's say Europe buckles. And let's say it works and it puts enough pressure on Iran. Then there are two possibilities of what Iran does. First possibility is they say, oh, Secretary Pompeo, we love Secretary Pompeo's 12-point strategy, and we're going to accept that. I think that's unlikely. The second possibility, if the sanctions work and they put enough pressure on them and Iran feels the pressure, is that they restart their nuclear centrifuge program. So those are two possibilities. But what I'd like to do is go through the 12 steps that you'd like Iran to do and sort of explore what these would mean if we thought about them in terms bigger than Iran. So one of your first things is, and this came up during JPOH, but nobody really could get this done. You want Iran to reveal the military dimensions of its nuclear program. Well, let's substitute Israel for Iran there. Mm-hmm. Does anybody think Israel is going to reveal the military dimensions of their nuclear program? Well, you'll say, well, they're our friend. Well, yeah, but from Iran's perspective, they see Israel as a rival and a regional rival. Let's put Saudi Arabia in there. Well, Saudi Arabia revealed the military dimensions of its nuclear program. Well, some might say, they don't really have it. But I'm guessing there are files over at the CIA that say, well, you know what, they have talked to people about purchasing it. Some say they have purchased nuclear technology. I guarantee we know that, and you probably can't admit it, but let's put Saudi Arabia in there. Are they willing to discuss anything they've done to develop nuclear weapons? So really what you're asking for is something that they are never going to agree to. Okay? You can try to cripple them. It's sort of like unconditional surrender. You're not getting that. Let's move on. Proliferation of ballistic missiles. I don't like them threatening surrounding countries or us with ballistic missiles. Nobody does. But they respond not just to us, they respond to Saudi Arabia. There's a 1,000-year-old war over there. There's a 1,000-year-old religious war over there, and there's hostility between the two. So when we supply weapons, when the Saudis buy ballistic missiles, the Saudis have a ballistic missile program, they respond to that. The Saudis and their allies, the Gulf Sheikdoms, spend 8 times more than Iran. So when you tell Iran, oh, well, you have to give up your ballistic missile program, but you don't say anything to the Saudis, you think they're ever going to sign that? They would have to be crippled and starving people in the streets for them ever to agree to give up their ballistic missile program. Had we kept the Iran agreement with them, and you said to the Iranians, well, we want less of an arms race over there. We'd like to have peace with Saudi Arabia. Could we get Saudi Arabia to the table with Iran to discuss either a freeze of ballistic missiles? You know, when we went to Russia, we didn't just succumb and say we'd give up our weapons. Neither did Russia. We did it in parity. We had an agreement. If you leave Saudi Arabia out of it, and you leave Israel out of it, and you look at Iran in isolation, that's not the way they perceive it. So I don't think they're going to jump at your 12 notions here of what you'd like them to do.
Senator, may I make just one point?
Go ahead.
I think the example of Saudi Arabia is a reasonable one. We have told the Saudis exactly what I asked from the Iranians.
To talk about their nuclear program?
They have said they want a peaceful nuclear energy program, and we have told them we want a gold standard Section 123 agreement from them, which would not permit them to enrich. That is simply all I've asked of Iran as well.
Do we have information that the Saudis have talked to actors in Pakistan and other places about purchasing nuclear technology?
Senator, I can't answer that here this morning.
Which is to say, we probably, in all likelihood, do have that information. And so the thing is, it's a one-way playing field. Unless we understand that there are 2 big players over there, really 3 big players. You got Iran, you got Israel, and you got Saudi Arabia. We want Iran to do things we're not willing to ask anybody else to do, and that we would never do.
Senator, I disagree with you. I think we ask most nations to do precisely what we're asking Iran.
Let's move on to another one of your 12 points. End the military support for the Houthi rebels. Well, once again, you're asking them to end it, but you're not asking the Saudis to end their bombardment of Yemen. I mean, if you look at the humanitarian disaster that is Yemen, it is squarely on the shoulders of the Saudis. And so we're going to ask the Iranians to quit supplying, and they, in all likelihood, are the ones supplying the missiles. And we get reports, and the Defense Department comes and says there have been 32 missile strikes in Saudi Arabia. Well, there's been like 16,000 bombings of Yemen by Saudi Arabia. Nobody even mentions that. We act as if it didn't even happen. If we are so ignorant that there are 2 sides to this war, we're never getting anywhere. Iran's not going to stop doing that, but they might if you sat them down with the Saudi Arabians and said this arms race doesn't make sense, and Saudi Arabia is willing to sit down at the table. You know, is Saudi Arabia willing to stop, another one's withdraw all forces under Iran's command throughout the entirety of Syria? There were dozens of groups in there, even ISIS, that were getting weapons from Qatar and Saudi Arabia. In fact, one of the leaked emails from WikiLeaks was from Clinton to Podesta saying, my goodness, we've got to stop Saudi Arabia and Qatar from funding ISIS. That's a direct email. They were acknowledging they knew about it, and they were acknowledging it was a problem, but weapons were flowing into all kinds of radicals in there. So if you want Iran to stop, and I mean, Saudi Arabia and Qatar are 10 times the problem. You know, the whole Syrian war has all of these radical jihadists. The people who attacked us came from Saudi Arabia. We ignore all that and we lavish them with more bombs. So really, until we acknowledge there are 2 sides to the war or 3 sides to the war in the Middle East, you're not going to get the agreement. I think it was naive to pull out of the Iran agreement, and I think in the end we'll be worse off for it.
Senator Udall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Secretary Pompeo, for being here today with us. As you know, the ZTE, the Chinese cell phone company, was hit with a $1.9 billion fine for violating U.S. law. The Department of Defense has also warned about the security vulnerabilities in these phones. Soon after ZTE reported its resulting financial problems, the Metallurgical Corporation of China made a decision to support a $500 million project in Indonesia, which included Trump-branded properties. Then, soon after President Trump sounded the alarm on behalf of the Chinese company ZTE, tweeting, and I quote here, President Xi of China and I are working together to give massive Chinese phone company, ZTE, a way to get back into business fast. Too many jobs in China lost. Commerce has been instructed to get it done. That's the end of the quote on the tweet. Many observers have found these events and their timing strange, I would say very strange. As you know, the Trump Organization owns assets around the world, in India, the Middle East, Panama, and it pursued a project in Russia well into 2016. Members of Congress and the executive branch are under an ethical duty to avoid even the appearance of a conflict of interest. Do you agree that there is at least an appearance of a conflict of interest with this sequence of events with China?
Senator, I haven't seen any indication that would support the connection that you seem to be drawing. I was part of the conversation early and then, frankly, more recently about ZTE. I knew about ZTE when my previous role, I knew about it, I was a member of Congress as well. This administration takes the threat the ZTE poses incredibly seriously. Indeed, it's the first administration to take any action against ZTE, in spite of the fact that it's been a known threat to the United States of America for years. Previous administration chose to do literally nothing against ZTE. And so the critiques that this administration has not done enough, and the many others that you refer to, I don't know who they are, aren't reflective of the deliberations that I've seen this administration undertake with respect to how to respond to ZTE.
Given that the president refuses to disclose his tax returns, how can you assure the American people that American foreign policy is free of his personal conflicts of interest?
Senator, I find that question bizarre.
You don't want to answer it then?
Senator,
You just want to describe it as bizarre?
Yes, I do.
Not give me an answer.
I think that's indicative of my answer, Senator.
Yeah.
I've been incredibly involved in this administration's foreign policy now for some 16 months, and I have seen literally no evidence of what you are
Well, that's what I want to
suggesting.
ask you specifically about. No, it's not scurrilously.
It is an outrageous suggestion.
My friend,
Senator.
it is not scurrilously. This has been raised by a number of people
Yes,
out
sir.
there.
Yes, sir, it has. You want me to tell you who those folks are and what their political
No,
interests
I
may
know.
well
It's
be?
fake news. Now, let me ask my question.
Yeah.
Okay. Back to the specific case with ZTE. Do you believe that it is in the U.S. interest to help the problematic ZTE phone company get back into business fast? That's the Trump tweet. And is the State Department using any resources to work with the Commerce Department on this issue?
So I don't know the answer to your second question. I've certainly been involved. So yes, the State Department's using some resources to work with the Department of Commerce, some part of my time. For sure, there may be others. Certainly my team members have been involved in this along the way as well.
But you don't, and then the first question was, do you believe that it is in the U.S. interest to help the problematic ZTE phone company get back into business fast?
I am convinced this administration will make a decision that is in the best interest of the United States of America with respect to ZTE and all things.
Now, the former ambassador to Panama recently told the New Yorker that the president asked him, quote, "What about the hotel?" That's the quote from the ambassador in the Oval Office meeting to discuss the U.S.-Panama relationship. Does the president ever discuss overseas Trump properties when discussing foreign policy issues with you?
I've never seen us make any decision based on anything like you're suggesting. So I don't know how else to answer that question.
Well, good. I just want a straight answer. That's great. I want to offer my condolences.
I'm not sure that was exactly your point there, Senator.
No, I wanted a straight answer from you. We'll see how history plays this out. I want to offer my condolences to the people of Cuba and to those who perished on the flight from Havana last week. This is yet another example over 50 years, failed isolationist policies towards Cuba, and it just continues on and on. The United States embargo prevents Cuba from leasing U.S. planes and parts. This is a safety hazard that may have led to a disaster on the island last week. The crashed plane was an inter-Cuba flight, a route that generally is not serviced by U.S. air carriers. This means that Cubans and American tourists alike are subject to the same dangers of a poorly regulated airline industry. There is no doubt that the U.S. companies would benefit from business with Cuban airlines, and Cubans as well as American tourists, I think, would be safer because of it. Unfortunately, this administration continues to backtrack on efforts to engage with Cuban officials. Would the State Department be open to a dialogue with Cuban officials to help improve air safety and upgrade aircraft to avoid another catastrophe?
Senator, the implicit suggestion there is somehow that the responsibility for this aircraft's failure didn't rest with Cuba and its people. I simply disagree with that. I'm happy to consider whether there are useful and appropriate mechanisms for the State Department to engage with Cuba on civil aviation. I don't know the answer to the question.
Yeah. Well, the point the question was trying to make is when there's cooperation on all fronts in Cuba, I think Americans do better and Cubans do better. And that's what the last policy of the last administration was, to uplift everyone. And when I had a discussion with you in my office, you talked about we're going to try to have an engaged policy with Cuba. We're not going to go backward. But my time's up, Mr. Chairman, so I would wait for the second round. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. On the ZT issue, there were a few of us that were part of a briefing last night, and I do think that having nothing to do with other countries' interest, I think that I do think the administration